Human Rights recorded 1,900 civilian casualties. The total consists of 726 people killed, including 52 children, and 1,174 injured, including 63 children. The actual number is likely much higher. Most of these casualties were caused by the use in populated areas of explosive weapons with a wide impact area. Hundreds of residential buildings have been damaged or destroyed, as have hospitals and schools. OHCHR continues to monitor reports of civilian casualties in the whole country, including in territory controlled by the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. OHCHR staff in Donetsk are closely following the developments regarding the 14 March incident in which 20 civilians were reportedly killed by a Tochka U missile that may have contained cluster munitions. All such instances must be properly investigated. It is the responsibility of all sides to fully abide by their obligations to protect the lives of all civilians everywhere. OHCHR is gravely concerned about reports of arbitrary arrests and enforced disappearances of civilians, local authorities, and civil society activists in Russian-controlled areas. We call for their immediate release. Mr. President, this week there were positive signals reported regarding the ongoing direct talks between Ukrainian and Russian representatives. We welcome all such engagements. However, we note that these signals have so far not translated into the cessation of hostilities that is so desperately needed. The situation in the southeastern port city of Mariupol is particularly alarming. Many of the Mariupol residents who have not been able to safely evacuate lack food, water, electricity, and medical care. Uncollected corpses lie on city streets. Yesterday's strike on the Mariupol theater, which reportedly served as a bomb shelter for displaced civilians, adds to the list of attacks against civilian structures. While early reports indicate that the worst may have been avoided, ongoing fighting is hampering the rescue work and assessment of the situation. Mr. President, the devastation and suffering in Mariupol and Kharkiv raises grave fears about the fate of millions of residents of Kyiv and other cities facing intensifying attacks. International humanitarian law is crystal clear. Civilians are entitled to protection against the dangers arriving from military operations. Direct attacks on civilians are prohibited. Yet, the magnitude of civilian casualties and the destruction of civilian infrastructure in Ukraine cannot be denied. This demands a thorough investigation and accountability. Mr. President, the priority for the UN and its partners is to reach the people trapped by the ongoing shelling, including in eastern Ukraine. To that end, we continue to scale up our operations on the ground as circumstances permit. The needs of the population are growing by the day. The UN calls for safe passage for civilians from and humanitarian supplies into encircled areas. We are grateful to neighboring governments for their generosity in receiving refugees and enabling the provision of assistance to Ukraine. The UN is requesting all donors to fast-track funding against pledges made toward the Ukraine flash appeal. The appeal, which seeks $1.1 billion to help 12 million people in need, is 36% funded. Mr. President, UNDP projects that 90% of the Ukrainian population could be facing poverty and extreme economic vulnerability should the war continue, setting the country and the region back decades and leaving deep social and economic scars. As the Secretary General highlighted, dangerous ripple effects of the conflict are already being felt across the globe. Russia and Ukraine represent more than half of the world's supply of sunflower oil and 30% of the world's wheat. Food, fuel, and fertilizer prices are skyrocketing. Supply chains are being disrupted. All of this is hitting the poorest the hardest and potentially creating instability around the globe. The Secretary General announced on 14 March the establishment of a global crisis response group on food, energy, and finance to lead an effort with member states to deal with the complex fallout of the war. The Deputy Secretary General will lead an interagency steering committee with partners to oversee this effort. Mr. President, the Secretary General welcomes all ongoing diplomatic contacts. He remains actively engaged with leaders who are trying to bring about an end to this war. There will be no winners to this senseless conflict. The tremendous loss it is causing, on the other hand, is heartbreakingly clear. And it is going to get much, much worse the longer the fighting continues. The Secretary General urges intensified and coordinated political efforts for an immediate cessation of hostilities. There must be a meaningful, sustained political process to enable a peaceful settlement. The lives of millions of Ukrainians and the peace and security of the entire region and possibly beyond depend on it. Thank you, Mr. President.
أشكر السيدة دي كارلو على إحاطتها. أعطي الكلمة الآن للسيد رؤوف مازو.
Mr. President, it has been less than 3 weeks since High Commissioner Grandi addressed this council. Within this short time span, the number of refugees from Ukraine in the neighboring countries has risen exponentially from the then 520,000 to over 3.1 million today, in what has become the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. With close to 2 million refugees from Ukraine, Poland has, in a matter of a few weeks, become one of the largest refugee hosting countries in the world. Some 490,000 people have fled to Romania, 350,000 to Moldova, 280,000 to Hungary, and 228,000 to Slovakia. Hundreds of thousands have now reached other European countries. A sizable number of people have also moved to the Russian Federation and to a smaller extent to Belarus. We are humbled by the remarkable resilience of the refugees, many of whom have left their home with next to nothing, and by the extraordinary hospitality of the host authorities and host communities. This solidarity illustrates the very foundation of the international refugee protection architecture and the spirit of the Global Compact on Refugees. The acts of compassion, humanity, and kindness we now witness daily bring hope and brighten an otherwise very grim reality. We strongly commend the governments of receiving countries for keeping their borders open to all those fleeing Ukraine, including third country nationals who must continue to be received without any discrimination. The robust response that these countries have mounted from scratch in an extremely short period of time is truly impressive. We are heartened by the bilateral and other support extended to the principal refugee hosting countries and the funding committed to us so far in support of the $1.1 billion US flash appeal for the response inside Ukraine and for the $550.6 million US towards the UNHCR-led regional refugee response plan, both launched on the 1st of March. The outpouring of support from the private sector and individuals who have jointly provided some 2/3 of the funds raised for the response so far must be lauded. All international support to the response is coordinated under the refugee coordination model led by UNHCR, which has been established in Poland, Moldova, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia, as well as in other countries in the region. The sum of collective expertise and support will be critical to help the refugee population and support host countries with shelter, emergency relief items, cash assistance, as well as mental health and psychosocial support. UNHCR has scaled up its response by deploying over 200 experts and established field presence in all countries. UNHCR staff on the ground undertake regular protection monitoring at the main border crossing points, reception centers, and other locations where refugee transit or gather. However, with the current pace of refugee outflows, the capacity of neighboring countries are being tested and stretched. We can and must do more to support, and we must do it now. As the situation evolves, UNHCR, in coordination with the host governments and partners, will assess the needs as necessary and is currently adjusting the regional refugee response plan. While some refugees transit through countries neighboring Ukraine, many also join families which have long settled in these countries. This is particularly the case in Poland, where with time passing and resources diminishing, the number of refugees needing integration will rise. They and the state which hosts them will need support to ensure their inclusion in all sectors of public life, health and education, access to labor and other services. With EU host countries receiving support from the rest of the Union, we are particularly concerned about the situation in Moldova, where over 350,000 people have arrived. This refugee crisis comes on top of pre-existing challenges. It is therefore crucial that sufficient resources are made available quickly to support the government's response. As critical as it is, funding is only one of the many forms of support that are urgently needed. We commend the recent launch of the EU Solidarity Platform, designed to ease the pressure on the countries neighboring Ukraine through transfers of vulnerable refugees to the other EU member states. We are grateful to those member states that have already made concrete pledges to transfer refugees from Moldova and encourage others to join this initiative, which constitutes a remarkable and innovative example of responsibility sharing in line with the key tenets of the Global Compact on Refugees. In addition, the EU activated for the first time in its history the Temporary Protection Directive, which enables refugees, asylum seekers, and stateless persons to arriving in Ukraine to quickly regularize their legal status, alleviating pressure on asylum systems. It shall also enable refugees to find work, access services, and benefit from social protection. Such temporary protection has also been announced by the governments of the United States, Canada, Switzerland, Brazil, and others. Mr. President, I wish to further highlight that 90% of the refugees fleeing Ukraine are women and children, indicating the heightened risk of gender-based violence and other forms of exploitation and abuse, including trafficking. As the Secretary General said, for predators, human traffickers, and human traffickers, war is not a tragedy, it is an opportunity. We are deeply concerned about media reports of incidents of gender-based violence and trafficking, and are supporting the efforts of government in scaling up prevention and risk mitigation measures, including through the Stay Safe campaign aimed at awareness raising and provision of information to refugees. As part of UNHCR's leading role in coordinating the UN refugee response, we have also deployed experts in PSEA coordinators to support the government's response in several refugee hosting countries. Mr. President, since the early days of this crisis, UNHCR committed to stay and deliver in Ukraine, and this is what we have done. Allow me to take this opportunity to express our deepest gratitude and admiration for our colleagues who have remained in Ukraine, but also to the whole humanitarian community. We believe that at least 2 million people have been forced to flee within Ukraine. Close to 13 million people have been affected in the hardest hit area, hardest hit by the war in Ukraine. Many people remain trapped in areas of escalating conflict and, with essential services disrupted, are unable to meet even the most basic of their needs. In many locations, such as Mariupol, residents face a critical and potentially fatal shortage of food, water, and medicines. People living with disability or serious medical condition are particularly impacted. UNHCR is closely tracking negotiation for safe passage and is preparing to send humanitarian supplies as soon as conditions allow. To facilitate the provision of life-saving assistance to the population most in need in Ukraine, we have adjusted our operational presence, relocating offices and warehouses to the western and central part of the country. Together with partners, we have been able to deliver critical supplies for displaced and conflict-affected populations, including core relief items and shelter materials. We're working closely with local authorities to establish and expand reception capacity in main locations where internally displaced people arrive. We coordinate the provision of key protection services such as legal aid, social accompaniment, psychosocial support, child protection, and gender-based violence case management. Where conditions allow, we distribute multi-purpose cash to help people make choices best suited to their needs. Flexible forms of assistance are crucial, as are innovative approaches. Despite all efforts, we are unable to respond to the sheer scale of the rapidly growing needs of the Ukrainian people and systematically deliver the much needed life-saving assistance. We cannot overemphasize the urgent call repeatedly made by the Secretary General, USG DiCarlo, ERC Griffiths. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected. International humanitarian law must be upheld, and safe passage for civilians in any direction they choose must be enabled. Safe humanitarian access to those in need and unhindered delivery of aid, including through a functioning humanitarian notification system, remains of paramount importance. Mr. President, in conclusion, allow me to paraphrase High Commissioner Grandi, who is today in Tajikistan after having left Afghanistan yesterday. On numerous occasions, he stressed that as we respond to the crisis in Ukraine, we cannot abandon or forget other recent and protracted humanitarian crises in many regions of Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East. Thank you.
أشكر السيد مازو على إحاطته. أعطي الكلمة الآن للدكتور تدروس أدهانوم غيبرييسوس.
Mr. President, Excellencies, dear colleagues, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to address it today. The war in Ukraine is having a devastating consequence for the health of Ukraine's people, consequences that will reverberate for years or decades to come. There is severe disruption to health services and access to basic commodities as a result of widespread destruction of infrastructure, including health facilities. WHO has verified 43 attacks on healthcare, with 12 people killed and 34 injured, including health workers. In any conflict, attacks on healthcare are a violation of international humanitarian law. They deprive people of urgently needed care and break already strained health systems. The disruption to services and supplies in Ukraine is posing an extreme risk to people with cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, HIV, and TB, which are among the leading causes of mortality in Ukraine. Displacement, poor shelter, and overcrowded living conditions caused by the conflict are likely to increase the risk of diseases such as measles, pneumonia, and polio. Services for mental health and psychosocial support are urgently needed to help people cope with the effects of the war. There are more than 35,000 mental health patients in Ukrainian psychiatric hospitals and long-term care facilities, which are facing severe shortages of medicines, food, heating, blankets, and more. The war is also exacerbating the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in Ukraine. With just 1/3 of the adult population fully vaccinated, this increases the risk of large numbers of people developing severe disease. Critical shortages of oxygen will have an impact on the ability to treat patients with COVID-19 and many other conditions. At least 8 facilities for producing and storing liquid oxygen have now closed. And we're seeking ways of accessing oxygen from neighboring countries and ways to deliver it safely to where it's needed. WHO is on the ground, working with the Ministry of Health and partners to support health workers and the health system to provide care to meet immediate health needs. So far, we have sent about 100 metric tons of medical supplies, including oxygen, insulin, surgical supplies, anesthetics, and blood transfusion kits, enough for 4,500 trauma patients and 450,000 primary healthcare patients for 1 month. Other equipment, including oxygen generators, electrical generators, and defibrillators, have also been delivered, and we're preparing to send a further 108 metric tons. We have now established supply lines from our warehouse in Lviv to many cities of Ukraine, but challenges with access remain. We need unfettered access. We have critical supplies ready for UN joint convoys to enter difficult areas, but so far we have not been successful. Today, for example, the UN convoy to Sumy that included a WHO truck carrying critical medical supplies was unable to enter. Loads ready for Mariupol remain in staging areas and cannot proceed. Access to this and other areas is now critical. To support Ukraine's health system, WHO is coordinating the deployment of 20 emergency medical teams consisting of experts from many countries to deliver care across a range of disciplines in Ukraine and neighboring countries, which have been generous in welcoming refugees but are struggling to meet their needs, as my colleagues earlier said. Those needs are immense and include continuity of care for basic illnesses, as well as more complex issues like cancer and renal dialysis, maternal and child health, HIV and TB, sexual and reproductive health, and mental health. Refugees and many of those who remain in Ukraine are already very vulnerable, especially women and girls. Protecting them from abuse and exploitation of all kinds must be a top priority for hosting governments and for all international organizations. Mr. President, today I have 3 urgent requests. First, We urge the Security Council to work for an immediate ceasefire and a political solution. Prolonged conflict is in nobody's interest and will only prolong the suffering of the most vulnerable. The life-saving medicine we need right now is peace. Second, we urge all donors to support the response to humanitarian needs in Ukraine and neighboring countries, which are immense and escalating every day. Thanks to donors who front-loaded WHO's contingency fund for emergencies, we were able to respond immediately, deploying these funds were supplemented by additional funding from the UN Central Emergency Response Fund, CERF. However, to sustain the response, we call on donors to fully fund the United Nations Emergency Appeal. As the Undersecretary General said, it's only 36% so far funded. We thank those donors who have already pledged funding to meet the needs of people in Ukraine. And third, although Ukraine is rightly the focus of the world's attention, I urge you not to lose sight of the many other crises in which people are suffering. In Afghanistan, more than half the population is in need, with widespread malnutrition and a surge in measles, among many other challenges. In Ethiopia, the blockade of 6 million people in Tigray for almost 500 days has created a catastrophic food and health crisis. In the Syrian Arab Republic, more than 12 million people are in need of health assistance, almost half of them children. And in Yemen, roughly 2/3 of the population, more than 20 million people, are estimated to be in need of health assistance. Mr. President, in every case, the only solution is peace. I repeat, in every case, the only solution is peace. And our world needs peace more than ever. As if COVID is not enough, to have a devastating war like this is dangerous for the world. I thank you, and back to you.
أشكر الدكتور غبريسوس على إحاطته. أعطي الكلمة الآن لأعضاء المجلس الراغبين في الإدلاء ببيانات. أعطي الكلمة لممثلة الولايات المتحدة.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to the briefers for your briefing today. Just 3 weeks ago, Russia launched its unprovoked, unjustified, unconscionable, full-scale invasion into Ukraine and assault on democracy. Now over 3 million refugees have fled the country, creating a devastating humanitarian crisis felt around the world. These refugees are mostly women and children. They stuffed their lives into backpacks and left their homes and everything they knew behind. Today, many of them know that their apartment buildings and streets have been bombed to rubble. And the horrors continue for those who remain in Ukraine. We just heard from the WHO DG that 43 hospitals have been attacked by Russia. 43 hospitals and health facilities. AP reporters on the ground showed the world a mass grave in Mariupol, a narrow trench filled with the bodies of children. Yesterday, Russian forces dropped a powerful bomb that hit a Mariupol theater where hundreds of civilians were hiding. The Russian word for children was written outside the theater, both front and back, in large white letters that could have been seen from the sky. Yet Russian forces bombed it anyway. Local officials have told families to leave their dead relatives lying outside on the streets, exposed to the world, because it is simply too dangerous with the bombs and shellings to hold funerals. I just met with Ukrainian civil society leaders. They reported that people standing in a bread line, trying to get food to feed their families, were shot dead by Russian soldiers. They reported terror, the terror that Russia is inflicting across Ukraine on the Ukrainian people. Russia will be held accountable for its atrocities. There's only one way to end this madness. President Putin, stop the killing, withdraw your forces, leave Ukraine once and for all. Yesterday, I listened to President Zelensky's speech to the United States Congress, and I was so moved by his words, his bravery, and his calls for help and for peace. Immediately afterward, President Biden announced another $800 million in security assistance to help Ukraine defend itself. That's more than $1 billion in the past week alone. We're not doing this by ourselves. Our allies and partners are fully committed to surging assistance to the Ukrainians. And we are grateful to all of our allies and partners who have opened their borders and their hearts and welcome Ukrainian refugees. We're also going to continue to provide humanitarian relief to support people within Ukraine and those who have been forced to flee, including the $186 million in additional assistance that Secretary Blinken announced on Tuesday. Here at the United Nations, we believe the best way to address the humanitarian crisis is through a resolution in the UN General Assembly. The resolution in the General Assembly will reflect the views of the overwhelming majority of UN member states and Ukraine itself. The International Court of Justice issued a profound and important order yesterday to the Russian Federation, and we call on Russia to comply immediately. Russia has clearly violated international law by violating the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Russia's brutal tactics have killed civilians, medics, and some of the journalists who have been showing us all the truth of this war. Russia has attacked so much of what we hold sacred, and everything the United Nations stands for. Russia's actions must be condemned in no uncertain terms. As President Biden said, Ukraine will never be a victory for Putin. No matter what advances he makes, no matter whom he kills or what cities he destroys, Ukraine will never be a victory for him. The United States stands with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, and we will do everything in our power to end this tragic, unnecessary war. Thank you.
أشكر ممثلة الولايات المتحدة على بيانها وأعطي الكلمة لممثل ألبانيا.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Rosemary, for your clarity and the very valuable information you provide every time you come to brief the Council. Thank you, Mr. Mazou and Director General Ghebreyesus, for your sobering information. Dear colleagues, 3 weeks into this unprovoked, unjustified, illegal, and deadly aggression by Russia, and the terrible facts are hardly surprising since anticipated nearly to the detail. Massive casualties among civilians, mass graves, widespread destruction of civilian infrastructure, ruined homes, schools, and hospitals, lives blown away by bombardments, children's dreams charred into smoke. There is no need to describe this devastating situation. Yet, as we just heard, and by the top UN representatives, not by the so-called West hysteria, is soul-wrenching and coincides with the shocking media reports on the horrors of the war and the misery unleashed upon Ukraine for no reason. I will maybe just recall the summarizing words of the Secretary General when he said 2 days ago, Ukraine is in fire and is being decimated. Guess by who? Over 3 million refugees in only 3 weeks, more than the entire population of my country. Some 2 million people displaced internally, 12 million people affected in the areas hardest hit by the war. UNICEF has evidence that since the start of the war, forced by this brutal aggression, every second a child has crossed the border of Ukraine. SRSG Patton warns that abuse, risks of sexual and gender-based violence, as well as trafficking, continue to mount amid wide-scale displacement. Several appeals for humanitarian corridors to evacuate civilians went unheeded. Many people remain trapped in areas of conflict and with essential services disrupted are unable to meet their basic needs, including food, water, and medicine. For the estimated hundreds of thousands who remain, there is simply nowhere to go. They can be killed even for queuing for bread, as it happened. This is the angry and the true face of the Russian aggression. Mr. President, the director of WHO that we just heard confirmed that there have been 33 attacks on Ukrainian healthcare facilities, infrastructure, and workers since the beginning of the invasion, otherwise 2 every day. There are, unfortunately, nearly a dozen conflicts in the world today. Out of 89 attacks on health system around the world this year so far, 33 have been only in Ukraine. Therefore, attacking healthcare facilities and workers is becoming a tactic of war in Ukraine. Nothing is being spared. First, there was this maternity ward in Mariupol. Then there was a mosque. Yesterday, Russians bombed the drama theater in Mariupol, a shelter for nearly 1,000 citizens who were not able to flee the city. And as it was mentioned, the word children in large Russian script was painted on the ground outside the theater. Everything must be bombed. Despite this grueling picture, the main news is not just what I said. The main news is that Ukraine is holding on, that Ukraine is resisting, that Ukraine is winning and Russia is deep in the mud. On the ground, morally, legally, and internationally. And we know now that for Russia to win this war of choice, it has to Grozny the entire Ukraine. It has to Aleppo all its cities. It has to Mariupol everything there. And even after that, we will be told here again that it's not their fault. C'est la faute à Voltaire. Mr. President, Ukraine won yesterday the first legal victory at the International Court of Justice. ICJ, the guardian of international law, ruled that there was no evidence to support Russian claims that Ukraine was committing genocide in the Luhansk and Donetsk. The court called for immediate suspension of any kind of military operations by Russia and entities, organizations, or persons under its control. So the question is, will Russia respect the court's order, or will it unplug and cancel itself completely, entirely, from the international law? Mr. President, beyond the human toll, the infrastructure and residential deliberate destructions and large-scale humanitarian crisis, there is another major crisis, the economic impact of the aggression. UNDP has warned that every day of delayed peace will accelerate a free fall into poverty in Ukraine. UNDP again projected yesterday that 90% of the Ukrainian population could be facing poverty and extreme economic vulnerability should the war deepen. In the event of a continuing protracted war in Ukraine, almost 1/3 of the population will fall below the poverty line, and a further 62% will be at extreme risk of falling into poverty within the next 12 months. It warned, again, the UNDP, that 18 years of social economic achievement could be lost. And this would set the country and entire region back decades, leaving deep social and economic scars for generations to come. Who in this room or outside it believes then a single word from Russia about SDGs, about Agenda 2030, because these terrible effects will not only be felt in Ukraine, but in the entire world? Mr. President, Russia has proposed a text for a humanitarian resolution. We think it is wrong. It is worst. It's a mockery of proportions, a move worth of the Guinness record of hypocrisy. Russia cannot shoot first and then come disguised as a doctor. The only way to minimize humanitarian consequences for the Ukrainian population is simple. Russia has to stop the war, withdraw its troops, and go home. No one should get confused by a text just because it is called humanitarian, when the only aim is to provide cover for the war. So colleagues, don't fall for the new clothes of the emperor. The Russian aggression is naked out there. Thank you.
أشكر ممثل ألبانيا على بيانه وأعطي الكلمة لممثلة المملكة المتحدة.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I join others in thanking our briefers today as well. As we've heard, it's 3 weeks since we met in this chamber to make one final effort to avert a Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's 3 weeks since we were interrupted by the news that President Putin had abandoned diplomacy and chosen war. These have been 3 devastatingly long weeks for the people of Ukraine, for the 3 million people who have fled, and for those who have stayed. As we heard from the UN, Russian forces are laying siege to populated cities and towns and indiscriminately shelling residential areas with high-impact weaponry, including cluster munitions. 43 healthcare facilities, including a maternity hospital, have been attacked, killing the most vulnerable and depriving civilians of access to medical assistance. And President Putin's war is causing suffering well beyond Ukraine's borders. Thousands of students, many from nations around this table, have been caught up in the violence. The war is spiking food and energy prices, bringing further pain to countries in the developing world already suffering from the impact of COVID and famine and conflict and climate. Millions of refugees have been taken in by countries across Europe. Mr. President, colleagues, 3 weeks since the start of Russia's invasion, one point should be clear in our minds. This is an unprovoked war of aggression waged by Russia. Russia is responsible for the suffering it has inflicted on Ukraine and beyond. Russia alone can end this war. 141 UN member states have unequivocally condemned Russia's illegal invasion. The International Court of Justice has issued a legally binding order requiring Russia to suspend military action in Ukraine immediately. This week, perversely, Russia tabled a resolution that, among other things, called for the protection of civilians, including women and children. This is cynical game playing in the face of human suffering. Just yesterday, in Mariupol, Russian forces reportedly targeted civilians taking cover from the onslaught, despite the word children written on the ground where they sheltered. If Russia really wanted to protect women and children, it would withdraw its troops from Ukraine and end this illegal invasion today. Thank you, Mr. President.
أشكر ممثلة المملكة المتحدة على بيانها وأعطي الكلمة لممثل فرنسا.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie la secrétaire générale adjointe aux affaires politiques, le haut-commissaire adjoint aux réfugiés et le directeur général de l'OMS pour leurs interventions. Celles-ci démontrent, avec l'impartialité et la rigueur qui caractérisent le travail des Nations Unies, la réalité de cette guerre menée depuis 3 semaines par la Fédération de Russie. Cette réalité, c'est la mort de civils innocents, ainsi que de journalistes et de personnels médicaux. C'est le chaos créé partout en Ukraine et bien au-delà, notamment par l'aggravation de l'insécurité alimentaire dans le monde. Ce sont les millions de vies brisées de toutes celles et tous ceux qui sont forcés de fuir leur foyer et qui ne trouvent répit ni dans les hôpitaux ni dans les écoles. Avec ses partenaires européens, la France continuera de se mobiliser pour l'accueil de ces réfugiés. Elle continuera d'apporter son soutien aux Ukrainiens. Elle a débloqué 100 millions d'euros à cette fin. La France appelle la Russie à cesser immédiatement cette guerre sanguinaire et à se conformer à l'ordonnance de la Cour internationale de justice rendue hier. Elle condamne, dans les termes les plus forts, le siège de plusieurs villes ukrainiennes et les bombardements indiscriminés visant les populations civiles. Elle appelle la Russie à se conformer au droit international humanitaire, à protéger les civils et les infrastructures civiles et à permettre l'acheminement de l'aide. Les attaques contre les hôpitaux sont constitutives de crimes de guerre. La France condamne également les actions qui ont pris des journalistes pour cible et elle rappelle l'obligation qui incombe aux forces armées de les protéger. La France est particulièrement préoccupée par les informations faisant état de l'emploi par la Russie de bombes à sous-munitions. Elle condamne une fois de plus le soutien que le régime biélorusse apporte à cette guerre meurtrière. Elle dénonce l'utilisation par la Russie de mercenaires, notamment syriens, qui ne sauraient exonérer la Russie de sa responsabilité. Celle-ci devra rendre compte de ces crimes. Nous saluons l'ouverture d'une enquête par le bureau du procureur de la Cour pénale internationale. La France dénonce enfin le cynisme de la Russie qui prétend à New York se soucier de la situation humanitaire en Ukraine alors qu'elle en est la cause unique. Le projet de résolution russe ne trompe personne. Il ne doit pas être soutenu. Le soutenir serait donner un blanc-seing à la Russie pour qu'elle poursuive cette guerre. Monsieur le Président, malgré les destructions et les souffrances, la guerre en Ukraine a révélé une autre réalité. Le peuple ukrainien fait preuve d'une résistance admirable. La France salue son courage et celui des autorités ukrainiennes. La communauté internationale est unie dans la condamnation de l'agression. De nombreux pays, dont la France, ont immédiatement pris des mesures visant les autorités russes et les cercles économiques proches du pouvoir pour les priver des ressources et les empêcher des moyens de poursuivre cette guerre. Ces sanctions ont déjà démontré leur efficacité et continueront à être renforcées pour renchérir le coût de la guerre jusqu'à ce que les autorités russes renoncent à la violence. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
أشكر ممثل فرنسا على بيانه وأعطي الكلمة لممثلة إيرلندا.
Thank you, President. I also would like to thank Under Secretary General DiCarlo Assistant High Commissioner Mazou and Director General Dr. Tedros for their very sobering briefings. Their messages are grim, very grim. We commend all humanitarian organizations working to alleviate the man-made catastrophe being visited on Ukraine. President, the cause of this catastrophe is clear. 3 short weeks ago, as we sat in this very chamber, as the Secretary General pleaded for peace, the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine. Since then, we have witnessed wanton devastation in a sovereign, independent nation with no regard for human life. To date, over 3 million people have had to flee Ukraine, becoming refugees in neighboring countries. We heard today 90% of those forced out of their homes and into uncertainty are women and children. Families torn apart. At least 2 million people are internally displaced, increasingly vulnerable and in need of immediate support. Ordinary people traumatized by a cruel and reckless war. Women and girls face heightened risk of being subjected to sexual and gender-based violence, including rape and trafficking. Their right to protection is being ignored. The destruction of the basic services all of us here at this table take for granted, food, water, sanitary systems, health and education, is having a devastating effect in Ukraine. Civilian casualties, we know, are in the thousands. Irish journalist Pierre Sachevsky was tragically killed alongside Ukrainian journalist Sasha Kushnova. They were both working to shine a light on Ukraine's plight. Our thoughts are with their families and every grieving and suffering Ukrainian family. Courageous journalists are showing the horrific impact of Russian aggression. I salute the free media putting their lives on the line to show us the truth. The humanitarian impact of this war is being felt around the world. It will affect the food security of countries heavily reliant on Ukrainian agricultural products, including in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. It will cause severe harm far beyond the borders of Ukraine. President, I find it a damning indictment that this Council has to plead with the Russian Federation not to deprive civilian populations of food and water, not to deny them the basic infrastructure they need for daily existence, for survival. It's a damning indictment that we in this Council have not been able to speak with a united voice to save innocent lives in this war. President, the images from a besieged Mariupol are shocking. We see once again that urban warfare takes the heaviest toll on civilians. We deplore the targeting of healthcare facilities, doctors taken hostage, life-saving care interfered with by military forces. Last week's attack by Russian forces on a maternity hospital in Mariupol plumbed new depths, resulting in the death of a mother and her newborn baby, a baby that never had a chance. We have to ask how many more. The residents of Mariupol are now melting snow or siphoning water from heating systems to quench their thirst. They're cutting down trees for firewood for cooking and to stay warm in freezing night temperatures. The city's supermarkets emptied because the basic necessities of life cannot be safely brought into the city. It is chilling to think that the suffering forced on Mariupol may be visited on other Ukrainian cities. There can be no justification for this brutal aggression. It should never have been perpetrated. It must be stopped. Ireland calls on the Russian Federation to comply with its obligations to protect civilian healthcare facilities and medical and humanitarian personnel. It must facilitate the safe passage and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance, including medical and food supplies. Whatever is agreed or not agreed on humanitarian corridors or other measures, civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected under international humanitarian law. This applies both to those who choose to leave and those who choose to remain. Surely, the most basic respect for human life must mean something to the aggressor even now. Let's be clear, the provision of humanitarian assistance is not dependent on a ceasefire. It is dependent on those bombing cities doing the right thing in accordance with their obligations. President, attacks directed against civilians and civilian objects, indiscriminate attacks and disproportionate attacks are all prohibited under international humanitarian law. Ireland remains gravely concerned by the humanitarian harm arising from use of explosive weapons in populated areas in Ukraine. There have been reports of the use of cluster munitions and thermobaric weapons by Russian military forces. These weapons cause mass casualties. They pose great risk for civilians when deployed in urban areas, including long after fighting has ceased. Their use is unconscionable. Equally, any use of white phosphorus against civilians or civilian infrastructure is abhorrent and contrary to international law. President, not only is Russia's war in Ukraine morally wrong, it is illegal. Yesterday, in granting Ukraine's request for provisional measures against the Russian Federation, the International Court of Justice was clear, it was emphatic. Russia must immediately suspend the military operations in Ukraine. In light of the court's decision, which is binding on the Russian Federation, which it cannot ignore, Ireland once again calls on the Russian Federation to comply with its obligations under international law and immediately end its aggression, unconditionally withdraw its forces from the entire territory of Ukraine, and refrain from further threat or use of force of any kind against Ukraine or any other member state. President, colleagues, for 3 long weeks, diplomacy has proved unavailing. For 3 long weeks, the world has watched this war with horror. Yet, we believe there is still a chance for peace. We urge the Russian Federation to do the right thing and commit to the diplomatic path in good faith. It is never too late to do the right thing. Thank you.
أشكر ممثلة إيرلندا على بيانها وأعطي الكلمة لممثلة النرويج.
Thank you, President. I join others in thanking briefers for their sobering presentations. 3 weeks ago, Russia launched its military aggression and invaded Ukraine. And since the start of the war, a Ukrainian child has become a refugee almost every second. Over 3 million civilians have crossed the borders into neighboring countries seeking protection, and over 2 million people are displaced inside Ukraine. They are fleeing from the horrors of Russia's unjust and illegal war against Ukraine, from the destructive power of one of the world's biggest war machines, from Russia's shelling of homes, schools, and hospitals, from Russia's indiscriminate use of explosive weapons and their deplorable use of cluster bombs, weapons that destroy cities, killing civilians even while they are fleeing or hiding. The human suffering is unacceptable. We encourage countries to keep their borders open to all those seeking safety outside Ukraine without discrimination. And we commend the generosity of the neighboring countries and their solidarity with those fleeing the war. Many of those fleeing are in a vulnerable situation, as we heard from Dr. Tedros, at risk of sexual and gender-based violence, trafficking, and other forms of exploitation. traumatized children and adults in need of mental and psychosocial support. We encourage the humanitarian organization to give priority to these issues in their response. President, civilians must be protected at all times, and humanitarian and medical workers must also be protected and allowed safe, rapid, and unhindered access to people in need. The protection of civilians and humanitarian access are not a matter of choice. They are legal obligation under international humanitarian law, obligation which must be respected. And those responsible for violation must be held accountable. President, Russia's war is causing despair and suffering with global implication. Russia is responsible for the increased food prices and higher risk of food insecurity that many countries now face. Russia's war against Ukraine will further exacerbate humanitarian crisis, death and disaster for people across continents. Russia, and Russia alone, bears the sole responsibility for the war and humanitarian crisis. Russia must stop its military aggression against Ukraine. Russia must comply with the order by the International Court of Justice to immediately suspend its military operation in Ukraine. If Russia cares about the humanitarian suffering this war is causing, then Russia should stop its senseless and illegal war. The Russian draft resolution has no credibility. It will not stop the war and the suffering. We echo the call of the Secretary General that political dialogue, negotiation, and mediation are the only way forward. We need to see genuine talks that translate into concrete results on the ground, and they must be inclusive. We need to see women included meaningfully in all talks, negotiation, and mediation efforts. And for the sake of humanity, this war must stop. Thank you.
أشكر ممثلة النرويج على بيانها وأعطي الكلمة لممثل الهند.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me thank USD DiCarlo, UNHCR Assistant High Commissioner Mazzo, and WHO Director General Dr. Ghebreyesus for their respective briefing on the security and humanitarian situation in Ukraine. India continues to remain deeply concerned at the ongoing situation, which has progressively deteriorated since the beginning of the hostilities. The conflict has resulted in death of civilians, displacement of thousands of people internally, and outflow of more than 3 million refugees to neighboring countries. The humanitarian situation has worsened, particularly in the conflict zones. There is an urgent need, therefore, to address the humanitarian needs of the affected population. In this regard, we support the initiatives of the UN and its agencies who have mobilized whatever is possible in the shortest possible time frame. We hope the international community will continue to respond positively to the humanitarian needs of the people of Ukraine, including through extending generous support to Secretary General's flash appeal and the Regional Refugee Response Plan on Ukraine. Keeping in view the dire humanitarian situation unfolding in Ukraine, India has already sent over 90 tons of humanitarian supplies to Ukraine and its neighbors as a part of the 9 separate tranches of humanitarian assistance delivered thus far. These supplies have included medicines and other essential relief material. We are in the process of identifying other such requirements and sending further supplies in the coming days. India has ensured the safe return of about 22,500 Indians from Ukraine. We have also assisted nationals from 18 other countries in that process. We are deeply appreciative of the facilitation rendered by the authorities of Ukraine and its neighboring countries in ensuring their safe return. Allow me to underscore that it is important that the humanitarian action is always guided by the principles of humanitarian assistance, which is humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These measures should not be politicized. we reiterate our call for immediate cessation of hostilities across Ukraine. Our Prime Minister has reiterated this on several occasions and called for immediate ceasefire and emphasized that there is no option but the path of dialogue and diplomacy. We stand ready to continue to engage on these objectives in the Security Council as well as with the parties in the coming days. We continue to underline the need to respect the UN Charter, international law, and the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of states. I thank you, Mr. President.
أشكر ممثل الهند على بيانه وأعطي الكلمة لممثلة غانا.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this meeting and also thank the distinguished briefers for the updated information on the prevailing humanitarian situation in Ukraine. I also welcome the participation in this meeting of the representatives of Poland and Ukraine. Mr. President, Ghana reiterates once more the call on the Russian Federation for an unconditional and immediate ceasefire and for the withdrawal of all its invading troops from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. The cessation of hostilities is critical to save lives and prevent further devastation to the Ukrainian people. It remains fundamental to addressing the worsening humanitarian situation. We remain deeply concerned about the military escalations and the disproportionate use of unconventional munitions in bombarding the cities and civilian populated areas of Ukraine, and we are disheartened by the trauma that the situation has caused, especially to the aged, women, and children. The parties to the conflict must urgently commit to a humanitarian pause to enable the evacuation and safe passage of civilians and facilitate the delivery of food, medicine, and other essential services to those in critical need and those who have been caught up in the cities under siege. We also deplore the attacks on medical facilities and call for the protection of humanitarian workers and medical personnel. We urge the parties to comply with their commitments under international law and international humanitarian law, in particular, the provisions of the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949 relating to the protection of civilian persons in the time of war. We continue to urge the parties to accept the path of diplomacy and dialogue in resolving their security concerns. We believe that the good offices of the Secretary General should be leveraged to facilitate a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Mr. President, in concluding, I wish to emphasize that the interest and safety of the Ukrainian people should be prioritized and must be at the forefront of the actions of this Council and all other international actions. I thank you for your kind attention.
أشكر ممثلة غانا على بيانها وأعطي الكلمة لممثل غابون.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, je remercie Madame Di Carlo, le docteur Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus et Monsieur Raoul Mazou pour leurs exposés sur la situation humanitaire en Ukraine. L'intensification des combats et l'exode massif des populations civiles qui en découlent, la détérioration des conditions de vie et des conditions sanitaires de ceux qui décident de rester, les risques de maladies liés à la rupture de fourniture de services publics de base sont autant de sujets de préoccupation. Nous exhortons à nouveau toutes les parties à respecter les dispositions du droit international humanitaire, à garantir le respect et la protection des populations, y compris des ressortissants africains, ainsi que des infrastructures civiles, du personnel médical et des travailleurs humanitaires. Nous réitérons l'urgence d'ouvrir des corridors humanitaires sécurisés et appelons à l'arrêt immédiat des hostilités. Sauver des vies doit transcender toute considération politique. Les parties au conflit doivent saisir toutes les possibilités qu'offre la diplomatie pour parvenir, par le dialogue, à un règlement négocié et éviter l'enlisement. Je vous remercie.
أشكر ممثل غابون على بيانه وأعطي الكلمة لممثلة كينيا.
Mr. President, I thank the briefers for their presentations this afternoon. Kenya is gravely concerned that 3 weeks on, the armed conflict in Ukraine has continued unabated. The continuing reports of loss of lives and displacement and separation of loved ones, including through millions of refugees in just 3 weeks, is deeply disturbing. Kenya extends its condolences to the families who have lost loved ones to the conflicts and stands in solidarity with all the affected. We commend Ukraine's neighbors for opening their borders to refugees of multiple nationalities, and we urge them to continue ensuring that protections sought are offered with no discrimination on any basis, and particularly in regard to race or religion. Kenya condemns the targeting on and destruction of civilian objects and infrastructure, particularly residential homes, hospitals, and shelters. The parties are obliged to comply with international humanitarian law. We remind that civilians, including foreign nationals in Ukraine, are not party to the conflict and must not be a target. In this regard, all actors, including the parties, must consider to prioritize the safety and interest of civilians in accordance with international humanitarian law. The imperative to ensure that humanitarian passages are open and functioning in all times cannot be overstated. We believe that there is an urgent need for humanitarian resolution that reflects the unity and the resolve of this Council to assist the people of Ukraine. Ultimately, the only way out of this crisis is an immediate and unconditional cessation of the military campaign. We urge the parties to do this to allow humanitarian assistance to flow and create room for diplomacy and constructive dialogue, including through the good offices of the UN Secretary General, towards a sustainable political solution. We underscore the need for an urgent resolution of this armed conflict. Its impact is already being felt through increased food prices, fertilizer, oil, and other essentials by multiple countries. If it is not quickly prevented, this trend, including the added effects of unilateral sanctions, will aggravate state fragilities and fuel ongoing conflicts across the world, especially in the global south. In closing, Mr. President, Kenya restates its recognition of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the political independence of Ukraine. I thank you.
أشكر ممثلة كينيا على بيانها وأعطي الكلمة لممثل البرازيل.
Thank you. Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to thank for their briefings Ms. Rosemary De Carlo, the WTO Director General Tedros Ghebreyesus, and Mr. Raouf Mazou from UNHCR. As the conflict in Ukraine lingers on, the dire humanitarian situation in the region is further deteriorating. Brazil is deeply concerned with the growing number of civilian casualties, including children, as well as the increasing flows of refugees and internally displaced people. According to some estimates, the number of people impacted by the conflict is around 18 million, of which more than 6 million are internally displaced and nearly 3 million people have fled Ukraine. The destruction of infrastructure has caused food shortages, energy outages, and intermittent communications. Under these circumstances, Supply chains have been disrupted. The access to medical facilities is impaired. Medical supplies are running low, their distribution is uncertain, and some stockpiles are out of reach due to military operations. Hospitals and medical personnel are struggling to provide care to the sick and wounded. In response to the most pressing needs for humanitarian assistance, the Brazilian government has sent last week a donation encompassing water purifiers, around 9 tons of foods, and half a ton of medical items, totaling approximately 20,000 items donated by the Brazilian Ministry of Health. With the assistance of the Embassy of Brazil in Warsaw, the supplies were landed at that capital and delivered to Ukraine in coordination with the country's authorities. The international community must come to the assistance of the people most in need, not only those directly afflicted by the hostilities in Ukraine territory, but also refugees in the neighboring countries. We commend the World Health Organization for its work to ensure the delivery of health supplies to Ukraine and its neighboring countries. The availability of medical personnel, medicines, and health equipment is crucial to meet the urgent needs of those sick and wounded. At this moment, Ukraine's health system is under critical pressure to cope with the demands for assistance from the many victims of this conflict. It is distressing to know that as of 12 March, the World Health Organization had verified 31 attacks on healthcare facilities in Ukraine, resulting in dozens of deaths and injuries, including health workers. The attacks against healthcare are particularly worrisome since they deprive people of life-saving services. Attacks on healthcare are violations of international humanitarian law. We reiterate our position that the immediate cessation of hostilities in Ukraine is the main condition to guarantee the passage of civilians from conflagrated zones to safe areas. Moreover, only with a comprehensive and effective ceasefire, it would be allowed the rapid, safe, and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance to those in need. I thank you, Mr. President.
أشكر ممثل البرازيل على بيانه وأعطي الكلمة لممثل الاتحاد الروسي.
Благодарю вас, господин председатель. Мы внимательно выслушали наших бриферов. Разделяем озвученные озабоченности ООН о гуманитарном кризисе, который разворачивается в ряде регионов Украины. На него справедливо указывают и наши коллеги по Совету Безопасности. Однако разница в том, что оценки некоторых, в частности, западных государств, базируются помимо ситуации с беженцами на раздуваемой с самого начала российской специальной военной операции на Украине кампании дезинформации, которая берет все новые и новые высоты. Вот и сегодня мы услышали целый ряд подобных сообщений из уст наших коллег. Это и обвинение в обстреле, ставшего уже нарицательным, роддома в Мариуполе, и о том, что Россия бомбила мечеть султана Сулеймана в Мариуполе, и о том, что российские войска из автоматического оружия расстреляли очередь в Чернигове. Все эти фейки неоднократно опровергались. Я, во-первых, хочу сказать своей американской коллеге, когда она сослалась на генерального директора ВОЗ, который якобы сказал, что Россия разбомбила, что 33 госпиталя были подвергнуты бомбардировке Россией. Я хочу обратить внимание, что генеральный директор ВОЗ, спросите у него, этих слов не говорил. Насколько нам известно, не в правилах ВОЗ осуществлять атрибуцию о том, кто произвел те или иные удары по медицинским учреждениям. А вот к вопросу об атрибуции, о том, кого считать виновным в разрушении медицинских учреждений на Украине, у нас много вопросов. Мы еще к этому вернемся. В Чернигове расстрел очереди. Это было давно уже опровергнуто. Российских военнослужащих в Чернигове нет. Это все, скорее всего, последствия бездумной раздачи оружия кому угодно на Украине. Хочу сказать, что было за это время, помимо других видов вооружений, было роздано населению бесконтрольно 25 тысяч автоматического оружия. Мечеть султана Сулеймана в Мариуполе. Президент фонда мечети султана Сулеймана в Мариуполе опроверг сообщение о том, что турецкая мечеть с 80 мирными жителями была обстреляна российскими войсками. Так что я не знаю, кто войдет в книгу рекордов Гиннесса по цинизму, но я точно знаю, кто войдет по рекорду фейков за одно заседание Совета Безопасности в книгу рекордов Гиннесса. Как я уже говорил, своего рода символом, работающей сейчас на полную мощность западной и украинской фабрики фейков, стала ситуация в Мариуполе вокруг него. Хочу пояснить для тех, кто не знает, в чем особенность этого города. В ходе событий 2014-2015 годов, когда украинская военщина бросила на несогласных с новой майданной властью жителей востока страны самолеты и танки, Мариуполь был одним из главных центров сопротивления в Донецкой Народной Республике. Его жители почти единогласно поддержали независимость республики в ходе референдума, активно выступали против националистического киевского режима. Этого украинские нацисты им не забыли. Утопив город в крови, они превратили его в своего рода штаб-квартиру и оплот добровольческих нацистских батальонов. Прежде всего Азов, а также правого сектора. В аэропорту Мариуполя находилась печально известная тюрьма пыточная со всей соответствующей атрибутикой. Рвами с телами замученных, карцеры и бензопилы. Это не средневековье, это неонацизм. Именно поэтому украинские радикалы так цепляются за этот город. Во-первых, он скрывает множество доказательств их преступлений. А во-вторых, они понимают, что за них придется отвечать. Поэтому они готовы утянуть за собой в могилу хоть все население Мариуполя. Так же, как это делали нацисты в осажденном Берлине в 1945 году, они удерживают жителей в качестве живого щита, не давая им эвакуироваться и размещая рядом с жилыми объектами тяжелое вооружение в нарушение норм международного гуманитарного права. Этого ни наши западные партнеры, ни, к сожалению, представители секретариата ООН упорно не желают замечать. Однако правду скрыть трудно, мы отмечаем заявление МККК, высвечивающее такие факты. В подобной обстановке неудивительно, что Мариуполь стал едва ли не лидером по числу и изощренности фейков, производство которых является одним из главных занятий украинского режима. Выделю тройку самых шокирующих из них. Первый – это, безусловно, бывший роддом Мариуполя, якобы разрушенный российской ракетой. Не буду на нем подробно останавливаться, мы уже об этом говорили, и мы изложили данную информацию в письме на имя Генерального секретаря ООН. Сложно найти разумное объяснение тому, что наши западные коллеги решили не только не замечать наше заблаговременное предупреждение о том, что роддом давно превращен в огневую точку украинских националистов. Но неоспоримые данные о постановочном характере устроены там в лучших традициях белых касок фотосессии, равно как и мнение авторитетных баллистических экспертов о том, что в здание ничего не попадало, а имел место подрыв. О втором фейке мы услышали в том числе сегодня от наших западных коллег. Россия якобы нанесла удар по Мариупольскому драмтеатру, где укрывалось более 1000 человек. На самом же деле, еще 13 марта в широком доступе частными лицами была опубликована информация, полученная от жителей Мариуполя, чудом вырвавшихся из города, что Азов удерживает в этом здании огромное количество людей и готовит кровавую провокацию. Не случайно поэтому это нас не удивляет, что там было написано слово «дети». Вооруженные силы России были информированы о ситуации, да и изначально здание театра не расценивалось российскими войсками как цель для авиаудара. Своевременное же нахождение в местах подобных провокаций западных журналистов, рапортующих о случившемся, уже становится трагической приметой происходящих на Украине провокаций, покрывающих беззаконие со стороны ВСУ и нацбатальонов. После того, как маховик западной пропаганды разгоняет по мировым СМИ трагическую фотографию мужчины, потерявшего жену из-за удара ВСУ ракетой .У с кластерными боеприпасами, по центру Донецка, выдавая происходящее как сцену из Киева, призывать вас к какой-то объективной оценке сложно. Еще раз напоминаю, что никто из вас, из западных СМИ, не сказал ни слова о трагедии в Донецке, унесшей жизни более 20 мирных жителей. Наконец, третий фейк. Россия якобы насильно пытается вывести жителей из Мариуполя и других украинских городов к себе, поэтому открывать следует лишь гум-коридоры на Украину. Это откровенная ложь. С начала специальной военной операции на горячую линию Минобороны России поступило свыше 2,5 миллионов запросов о эвакуации в Россию. С сожалением вынуждены констатировать, что пока не получается эвакуировать всех, потому что им запрещают это делать украинские власти. Но только за предыдущие сутки из, наконец, разблокированного нами многострадального Мариуполя была обеспечена безопасная эвакуация свыше 31 тысячи мирных граждан, в том числе 89 иностранцев, среди которых 71 сотрудник ОБСЕ, 9 граждан Греции и 9 граждан Пакистана. Из 31 тысячи эвакуированных только 36 человек перебрались на подконтрольные Киеву территории Днепропетровской области. Остальные выбрали путь в Россию и в населенные пункты Запорожской и Херсонской областей, подконтрольные вооруженным сил России, выразив категорический отказ переезжать на контролируемые киевскими властями территории. Вся гумоперация проводилась силами подразделений ДНР и вооруженных сил России без какого-либо участия украинской стороны. Обращаю ваше внимание, что сегодня автомобильная пробка на выезд из Мариуполя в направлении освобожденных от укронацистов Бердянска и Мелитополя составила 10 километров. Пока в город не вошли российские силы, такого мы не наблюдали. И это неудивительно, ведь мирные жители, как я уже сказал, нужны были нацистам в качестве щита. Те, кто спасся из Мариуполя, рассказывают о массовых бесчинствах и преступлениях батальонов территориальной обороны, издевательствах над стариками, женщинами и детьми. Всем этим людям оказывается индивидуальная медицинская и психологическая помощь. По-разному пока складывается ситуация на других направлениях. Вчера нами в полном объеме был соблюден режим тишины по ранее предложенным украинской стороне гуманитарным коридорам, на Киевском, Запорожском, Житомирском, Сумском, Харьковском и Полтавском направлениях. Это неоднократно подтверждено средствами объективного контроля, в том числе с использованием беспилотных летательных аппаратов. По открытым в сторону России гуманитарным коридорам неонацисты никого не выпускали, угрожая физической расправой. А тех, кому удавалось прорваться, безжалостно обстреливали. Вчера на Харьковском направлении в очередной раз под обстрел попала автобусная колонна с беженцами, двигавшимися по гуманитарному коридору в сторону России. В результате 4 человека погибли, есть раненые. Однако, несмотря на все трудности и препятствия, только за прошлые сутки, без участия Киева, из опасных районов нам удалось эвакуировать 12 440 человек, из них 2242 ребенка. Всего с начала специальной военной операции уже 271 231 человек, из которых 58 422 – это дети, пересекли границу России, включая 31 тысячу единиц личного автотранспорта. Мы готовы принять и больше людей. В субъектах Российской Федерации продолжает функционировать свыше 9,5 тысяч пунктов временного размещения. На освобожденных же территориях нами создаются все необходимые условия для беспрепятственного доступа желающих к гуманитарной помощи, которая в ряде мест фактически остается единственной возможностью выжить. При этом медикаменты, одежда и продовольствие, поступающие от международных организаций, в частности от МККК, мэры украинских городов перепродают местным предпринимателям. Такие факты нами достоверно установлены в городах Житомир, Ивано-Франковск, Винница, Ровно, Луцк, Дубна, Владимир-Волынский и Львов. В заложниках, по сути, в заложниках у батальонов территориальной обороны продолжают оставаться 6910 иностранных граждан из 22 государств, а также экипажи 70 иностранных судов в заблокированных морских портах Украины в связи с высокой минной опасностью, созданной киевскими властями в своих внутренних водах и территориальном море, а также в связи с возможными провокациями ВСУ со стороны берега. Мы продолжаем осуществлять поставки гумпомощи нуждающимся жителям Украины. Только в Мариуполь нами было доставлено уже более 450 тонн продуктов питания, медикаментов и предметов первой необходимости. Всего же со 2 марта силами МЧС и Минобороны России в отдельные районы Украины, включая Донбасс, в общей сложности уже доставлено без малого 3000 тонн гуманитарных грузов, а также стройматериалов. Другой вопрос в том, что в ряде случаев местная администрация просто-напросто угрожает расправой за получение российской гумпомощи. На этом фоне почти каждый день мы видим сообщения из западных столиц о новых поставках Киеву очередных партий всевозможных вооружений. Только вчера Вашингтон объявил, что уже на этой неделе передаст Украине оборонную помощь на $1 миллиард. Вы подливаете бензин в этот конфликт. Уже сейчас очевидно, к какой трагедии привела бесконтрольная раздача простого легкого оружия всем желающим. А знают ли западные избиратели и налогоплательщики о рисках попадания этого вооружения, включая ПЗРК, терроргруппам в Европе? Да и в целом, осознаете ли вы опасность подогревания ситуации на Украине для собственной безопасности? Все читали новости про упавший на территории Хорватии начиненный взрывчаткой беспилотник, прилетевший с территории Украины. К слову сказать, он остался незамеченным, хотя пролетел над несколькими странами, при этом от самой западной точки Украины до Загреба свыше 700 километров. Господин председатель, с сожалением констатируем, что Украина, как была для наших западных коллег пешкой в геополитической борьбе против России, такой и осталась. Западным политикам было наплевать на то, как все эти годы от украинских обстрелов страдали и погибали донбассцы, включая женщин, детей и стариков. Если бы это было не так, мы бы сейчас не сталкивались с неприглядной вознёй вокруг проекта гуманитарной резолюции Совета Безопасности по Украине. После того, как ее текст разработали Франция и Мексика, он сразу же перестал быть гуманитарным и наполнился политическими формулировками, не имеющими никакого отношения к гуманитарному вопросу. Без этого, как нам было четко сказано, западным странам проект не нужен. С тем, чтобы получить антироссийский продукт, они готовы продвигать его не в Совете Безопасности, а в Генассамблее, игнорируя то, что такой документ гуманитарщикам ничего не даст. Поэтому Россия внесла в Совет свой проект, содержащий все то, что нужно гуманитарщикам. Там нет только политических оценок, которых вы не найдете в других гуманитарных резолюциях Совета. Мы открыли документ для коспонсорства всех членов ООН. Однако нам говорят, что гуманитарная резолюция, представленная Россией, западные страны не устраивает. Это выдает истинные цели наших спонсоров первой гуманитарной, так называемой гуманитарной резолюции Совета. И это как раз и является настоящим лицемерием и цинизмом. Еще одним цинизмом является то, что на нас выходят коллеги из многих делегаций и жалуются на беспощадное давление и выкручивание рук со стороны западных партнеров, вплоть до экономического шантажа и угроз. Соединенные Штаты и Албания распространили письмо, в котором члены ООН призываются не спонсировать нашу резолюцию. Мы понимаем, как этим странам не просто противостоять этому натиску. По этой причине мы приняли решение пока не запрашивать голосование по нашему проекту, но проект резолюции мы не отзываем. А вместо этого завтра утром мы запросим срочное заседание, чтобы вновь обсудить тему биолабораторий США на Украине с учетом новых документов, попавших нам в распоряжение в ходе специальной военной операции. Прямо сейчас направим соответствующее письмо Эмиратскому председательству. Благодарю вас.
أشكر ممثل الاتحاد الروسي على بيانه وأعطي الكلمة لممثل الصين.
谢谢主席先生，我感谢迪卡洛副秘书长、谭德赛总干事和马周助理高专刚才所做的通报。中方对乌克兰人道局势的不断恶化深表担忧，对有关平民伤亡增加、难民人数增加的报道感到痛惜。当务之急是要呼吁各方保持最大的克制，保障妇女、儿童在内的所有平民安全和基本人道需求，防止发生更大规模的人道危机。中方支持有关当事方保持沟通，确保人道走廊安全畅通，继续为人员撤离和人道救援提供便利。当前冲突造成的难民和流离失所者人数仍在增加，对乌克兰和周边国家造成巨大冲击。中方支持联合国人道协调办公室、联合国难民署、世卫组织等机构积极开展行动，动员国际社会向所有有需要的人提供救援。前段时间，一些非洲裔、中东裔人员在撤离过程中遇到困难，应当引起重视， 并予以妥善解决。所有难民，无论肤色、种族、宗教信仰，根据国际难民法，都应获得必要的保护。中方高度重视乌克兰人道局势，提出了6点倡议主张。中国红十字会已经向乌克兰提供3批援助物资，其中第3批物资包括儿童奶粉和棉被等，重点帮助乌克兰红十字会救助受冲突影响的流离失所儿童。我们欢迎各方提出的任何有助于缓解和解决乌克兰人道危机的倡议和举措。安理会肩负负责维护国际和平与安全的首要责任，应当为缓解乌克兰人道局势发挥积极作用。中方期待安理会能在人道问题上保持团结，体现建设性态度。主席先生，国际社会普遍希望尽快实现停火，缓解现地局势，避免平民伤亡，这也是中方的期待。目前，俄罗斯和乌克兰已经举行了4轮谈判，能够保持谈判，就有实现停火的希望，就能开辟和平的未来。中方将继续劝和促谈，我们支持联合国和各方大力开展斡旋努力，也希望各方都能够多做有利于劝和促谈，而不是火上浇油的事情。实践证明，一味依靠制裁解决不了问题，还会制造出新的问题。在全球经济复苏乏力的情况下，无限制的制裁正在破坏国际产业链、供应链稳定，加剧粮食、能源危机，伤及各国，特别是发展中国家的民生，引发新的人道后果。这也是安理会在处理乌克兰人道问题是应该重视的问题。谢谢你，主席先生。
أشكر ممثل الصين على بيانه وأعطي الكلمة لممثل المكسيك.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Agradezco a la secretaria general adjunta, Rosmary Di Carlo, al subcomisionado para operaciones de la ACNUR, el señor Masou, y al director general de la Organización Mundial de la Salud, el doctor Ghebreyesus, por sus presentaciones. Han transcurrido 3 semanas desde el inicio de la invasión rusa a Ucrania y el saldo es realmente devastador. Hemos escuchado cifras trágicas, más de 3 millones de refugiados y cerca de 1.8 millones de desplazados internos. Son números exorbitantes, sobre todo si recordamos que hace exactamente un mes estábamos sentados en esta misma sala evaluando la implementación de los acuerdos de Minsk. Y en esa sesión, por cierto, se nos dijo que lo que ocurría en el terreno eran solamente ejercicios militares. ¿Cuál es entonces la perspectiva humanitaria si continúa el patrón que ha imperado hasta ahora? Quiero empezar por reconocer la disposición solidaria de todos los países que han recibido refugiados, especialmente aquellos quienes han asumido el influjo más numeroso. Pero las necesidades de las personas que no han podido salir o no han logrado ser evacuadas de las áreas urbanas acosadas han aumentado y seguirán creciendo, especialmente aquellas que no tienen acceso a servicios básicos, agua potable, alimentos o medicinas. Resulta, pues, imperativo garantizar el acceso seguro e irrestricto del personal humanitario, del personal de salud. Son los únicos que pueden brindar esos servicios básicos a la población civil. Señor presidente, como hemos escuchado, la Organización Mundial de la Salud ha registrado 43 ataques a instalaciones médicas en Ucrania. Y el hecho incontrovertible es que atacar instalaciones sanitarias está expresamente prohibido por el derecho internacional humanitario. Urge entonces garantizar que se respeten las más de 300 instalaciones médicas que se encuentran a lo largo de las líneas del conflicto o dentro de ellas. Deploramos también los ataques contra el personal de salud, así como de sus medios de transporte o del equipo que requieren para poder operar. Las consecuencias a corto y a largo plazo de estas acciones sobre la población civil y en contra de los sistemas de salud pueden, en efecto, ser irreversibles y por eso mismo son inadmisibles. Reiteramos nuestro llamado a cumplir con las resoluciones del Consejo de Seguridad en la materia, la 2286, que incluye menciones específicas a la protección del personal sanitario y humanitario, y la 2573, que se refiere a los bienes civiles considerados como indispensables. En el mismo sentido, encontramos la decisión emitida ayer por la Corte Internacional de Justicia, en la que se ordena la suspensión inmediata de las operaciones militares que comenzaron el pasado 24 de febrero. Como lo hemos reiterado ante este Consejo, la premisa fundamental para la asistencia humanitaria es el cese de las hostilidades. Señor presidente, en tanto que las Naciones Unidas y diversos actores humanitarios concentran sus esfuerzos en proveer la ayuda urgente que la población necesita, es oportuno reiterar también que la única solución a este conflicto será por la vía del diálogo y de la diplomacia. Reconocemos las iniciativas en curso, incluyendo el reciente encuentro en el marco del Foro de Antalya. Cualquier intento genuino de negociación debe ser bienvenido. Por ello lamentamos que a pesar no haya sido posible aún que este Consejo haga un llamado inequívoco al cese de las hostilidades. Un llamado en este sentido por parte del Consejo sería el mayor apoyo humanitario que pudiera recibir la población civil en Ucrania. Muchas gracias.
أشكر ممثل المكسيك على بيانه. أدلي الآن ببيان بصفتي ممثل الإمارات العربية المتحدة. أشكر كل من السيدة روزماري دي كارلو والسيد رؤوف مازو والدكتور تدروس غبريسوس على إحاطاتهم الوفية. ما استمعنا إليه اليوم يعكس التدهور الخطير للأوضاع الإنسانية جراء استمرار الصراع في أوكرانيا، حيث تواصل أعداد اللاجئين الارتفاع بوتيرة مثيرة للقلق، كما تستمر معاناة المدنيين في المناطق الأوكرانية بسبب العراقيل أمام وصول المساعدات الإنسانية مثل الغذاء والمعدات الطبية وغيرها من الاحتياجات الأساسية. وفي الوقت نفسه فإن الضرر الذي لحق بالبنية التحتية المدنية سيفاقم من تردي الوضع الإنساني في المدن الأوكرانية الرئيسية لا سيما ماريوبول. وفي هذا الإطار تود بلادي التركيز على 4 نقاط رئيسية. أولاً، أننا ننظر بإيجابية تجاه المفاوضات الجارية بين الاتحاد الروسي وأوكرانيا، ونأمل أن تسفر عن تهدئة تسمح للمنظمات الإنسانية بأن تقوم بمهامها وأن تلبي احتياجات المدنيين. وفي هذا السياق هناك ضرورة ملحة لاتخاذ خطوات ملموسة تهدف لتهدئة الأوضاع على الأرض وبناء الثقة بين الطرفين، بما في ذلك عبر التوصل لاتفاقات تمكن المنظمات الإنسانية من إيصال المساعدات للمحتاجين بطريقة آمنة، وإنشاء ممرات لخروج المدنيين، والتوصل لتفاهم يضمن حمايتهم. ثانياً، تثمن بلادي الدور الرئيسي لدول الجوار، وبالأخص بولندا ورومانيا ومولدوفا، بالإضافة لغيرها من الدول، في التعامل مع الأزمة الإنسانية من خلال استقبالها للاجئين وتوسيع شبكة الأمان الاجتماعي لتراعي احتياجاتهم. وفي الوقت نفسه ندرك من تجارب منطقة الشرق الأوسط أهمية دعم هذه الدول لتتمكن من رعاية اللاجئين بشكل كامل، خصوصاً وأن الصراع ما زال قائم، مما ينذر باستمرار موجات اللاجئين. ثالثاً، وبالتزامن مع جولات التفاوض الجارية، تشدد بلادي على أهمية الالتزام بالقانون الدولي، وبالأخص القانون الإنساني الدولي، والذي يمثل خرقه ليس فقط انتهاكاً لحقوق المدنيين، بل تهديداً للنظام الدولي. ونكرر هنا دعوتنا لجميع الأطراف المعنية إلى احترام التزاماتها الدولية ووقف استهداف المدنيين والبنية التحتية المدنية. وأخيراً، تؤمن دولة الإمارات بضرورة أن تركز استجابة مجلس الأمن للأزمة الإنسانية الناتجة عن الصراع في أوكرانيا على العمل الإنساني بطريقة عملية وهادفة، وذلك بالتنسيق مع مكتب تنسيق الشؤون الإنسانية والجهات الإنسانية الأخرى ذات الصلة. ونؤكد بأن الحل الوحيد للأزمة يكمن في تكثيف الجهود الدبلوماسية والوقف الفوري للأعمال العدائية في جميع أنحاء أوكرانيا، والسعي إلى سلام مستدام يحفظ استقلال وسيادة أوكرانيا وسلامة أراضيها، ويعزز الأمن والاستقرار في المنطقة والعالم. أستأنف مهامي كرئيس للمجلس. طلبت ممثلة الولايات المتحدة الكلمة لإدلاء ببيان آخر. أعطي لها الكلمة.
Thank you very much. I was momentarily pleased to hear that the Russians were pulling down the vote on their farcical humanitarian resolution, which was doomed to fail. We know if Russia really truly cared about humanitarian crises, the one that it created, it could simply stop its attacks on the people of Ukraine. But instead, they want to call for another Security Council meeting to use this council as a venue for its disinformation and for promoting its propaganda. Let us not forget that Russia is the aggressor here. They are the ones that are creating a pretext for attacks on their own people, and we can't be fooled by their efforts here. They have troops inside of Ukraine. They are killing people inside of Ukraine. That is the reason for us being here today, not to deal with their propaganda. Thank you.
أشكر ممثلة الولايات المتحدة على بيانها. أعطي الكلمة الآن لممثل أوكرانيا.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Madam Under Secretary General Di Carlo, Director General, Assistant High Commissioner. I also recognize the representative of the aggressor state present here in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. Let me begin with a quote. The operation is developing successfully and in strict accordance with plans that have been previously approved. End of quote. Said by Putin yesterday, 3 weeks after the unprovoked and unjustified Russian invasion of Ukraine started. Over these weeks, the international community was wrestled with the question, why? Why has the Russian Federation decided to cosplay the Nazi Third Reich by attacking the peaceful neighboring state and plunging the region into war? What are the reasons and what is the plan? And yesterday we got the answer. Killing Ukrainian children, 108 innocent souls so far. Let me quote again. Success in the strict accordance with the plans approved previously, according to Putin. Children are deliberate target, given yesterday's bombardment of the Mariupol Drama Theater, a shelter for hundreds of local residents, mostly women and children. Despite the big signs, children painted on the road on both sides of the building being clearly visible, Russian pilots dropped an aerial bomb. The building was fully damaged, but the shelter fortunately withstood. It did not turn into one of more mass graves, as Putin's plan probably envisaged, previously approved. Of course, Putin's plan does not limit murders to children only. All civilian Ukrainians and foreign citizens are under threat. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights recorded 726 confirmed cases of killing of civilians, while believing that the real figures are considerably higher. And they are indeed. Just yesterday in the city of Chernihiv, 53 civilian residents were killed by Russian bombs and shells. On the same day, in Merefa, Kharkiv region, 21 people were killed following Russian shelling that destroyed the local school and residential buildings. The plan is also to raze Ukrainian cities to the ground: Kharkiv, Sumy, Volnovakha, Akhtirka, Izium, and Mariupol. Pain for Ukraine and the entire world, and an eternal shame for Russia. Almost 2,400 confirmed victims among the civilian population. 90% of the city's infrastructure has been destroyed. Russian troops seized one of the hospitals, gathered 400 civilians there, and used the building as a military position, hiding behind civilians as a human shield. Let me quote, "The sufferings of Mariupol must not become the future of Ukraine," end of quote, said by Peter Maurer, the ICRC president, who is currently in Ukraine. The plan of Putin is to violate the agreements on ceasefire and safe passage for the civilian population from the temporarily occupied territories. Yesterday, Russian troops shelled a convoy of civilian vehicles headed from Mariupol to Zaporizhzhia. 5 people were killed, many injured, including children. And the plan is previously approved: to terrorize local residents who remain in the territories seized by Russian troops. Small villages where the Russian soldiers stay suffer the most. Russians break into houses, throw people out into the streets, take their food, eyewitness reports of tortures, abductions of local officials, and even extrajudicial killings come from across the occupied territories. Enforcing Ukrainians to flee their homes as refugees has also been a part of this Barbarossa-style plan. Almost 3.2 million refugees have left Ukraine so far. Against the backdrop of the increasingly aggravated humanitarian situation, Russia has dared to table a draft humanitarian resolution of the Security Council. An appeal by a serial killer to the UN members to co-sponsor this most egregious hypocrisy is outrageous. They may like to think twice if they want before they dive into the blood of children and adults executed by the Russian military in Ukraine. And let me quote St. Patrick in this regard. Never trust a dog to watch your food. At the same time, there is no doubt that action on the humanitarian front in the UN is urgently required, and I encourage all responsible nations to support the relevant efforts in the General Assembly. I also encourage all to join the group of Friends of Accountability following the aggression against Ukraine, co-founded by Albania, Colombia, Denmark, the Marshall Islands, the Netherlands, and Ukraine. This group will act as a forum among UN member states for the discussion and promotion of accountability measures in Ukraine following the Russian military aggression. Distinguished members of the Security Council, yesterday, the International Court of Justice delivered its order on provisional measures in the case concerning allegations of genocide under the Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, Ukraine versus Russian Federation. The court ordered that the Russian Federation shall immediately suspend the military operations that it commenced on the 24th February 2022 in the territory of Ukraine. Despite the order being binding on Russia under the UN Charter, today the Kremlin has openly and blatantly disregarded it, stating that they, and I quote, cannot take this order into account, end of quote, because there is no, I quote, agreement between the sides, end of quote. And should it be surprising for us? I don't think so, as from the very first instance of Russia's presence in the UN, it was in contempt of the UN Charter. That was the case when Russia was allowed to occupy the Soviet seat in the UN and the Security Council. That was the case in Georgia, in Syria, as well as in Ukraine's Crimea and Donbass in 2014. I encourage the Security Council members to exercise their duties envisaged by the Article 94.2 of the UN Charter to make recommendations or decide upon measures to be taken in the case of Russia's failure to comply with the obligations incumbent upon it under the judgment rendered by the court. Mr. President, perpetration-induced traumatic stress, although known as PITS, is a form of post-traumatic stress disorder. Its symptoms are caused by being an active participant in causing trauma. Sufferers of PITS may be found in many roles, such as soldiers or executioners, where they are expected to cause trauma, including death. But diplomats, especially here in the United Nations, especially here in the Security Council, compared to the more well-known and understood PTSD, there appears to be greater severity and different symptom patterns for those affected by PITS. The case of the military aggression of Russia against Ukraine and the mass atrocities perpetrated by the Russian army, ordered by Putin, and defended by the Russian diplomats, will be examined by scholars and scientists, including in the areas of sociology, history, philosophy, psychiatry, and theology. Today, however, I would like to quote from Into the Abyss, a documentary about executioners of the death penalty. One guard began crying and shaking uncontrollably when, I quote, "the eyes of all the inmates he had executed began flashing before him," end of quote. Ambassador, do the eyes of Ukrainian children, women, and elderly killed by the Russians flash before you? If they do, we may consider how to sponsor a decision to help you deal with perpetration-induced traumatic stress. But now have some decency and stop the egregious manipulation of the Security Council. It is obscene. It would be too much dignifying for the Russian delegation if I ended like here, like that. Instead, I would like to quote a tweet by Dario Franceschini, the Italian member of the government, who tweeted today, "Italy is ready to rebuild the theater in Mariupol. The Cabinet of Ministers has approved my proposal to offer Ukraine the resources and means to rebuild it as soon as possible. Theaters of all countries belong to the whole humanity," end of quote. And I thank you.
أشكر ممثل أوكرانيا على بيانه وأعطي الكلمة لممثل بولندا.
Mr. President, distinguished members of Security Council, I would like to thank Undersecretary General and the briefers for their important interventions today. And I shall start by paying tribute to the fearless Ukrainian soldiers and civilians alike who defend their homeland, freedom, and the UN Charter. They fight also for those who were forced to flee. I should also express gratitude to the work done by the UN OCHA, UNHCR, WHO, and its partners for maintaining their presence across Ukraine and continuing to deliver the assistance. Excellencies, the Security Council has gathered here today to discuss the fastest growing humanitarian and refugee crisis since the Second World War, the consequence of the Russian aggression on Ukraine. In light of this, I would like to stress the following points. Firstly, this is 100% a war of choice, and the methods of waging it is also the matter of choice. It is Russia that decided to refer to brutal force, indiscriminate weapons, as well as brutal siege tactics. Now they go as far as targeting journalists and kidnapping mayors of Ukrainian cities. In other words, the aggressor decided to change the nature of this conflict. It is a clear manifestation that Russia deliberately chose to create a humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine and bluntly disregards all the principles of international humanitarian law. And this should worry us all. Actually, disregarding the international law has been a pattern that Russia pursued in Syria and other places. To underpin this approach, earlier today the Kremlin has rejected an order by the International Court of Justice and the United Nations highest court to cease its attack on Ukraine. Secondly, without resolving the dire humanitarian situation, there will be no peace. Therefore, we urge Russia to change its military modus operandi and allow full and unimpeded humanitarian access and relief to those in need. The safe passage of civilians from different cities affected by the conflict must be allowed. Take the situation in Mariupol, where still around 350,000 residents remain trapped in the city as food, water, and medicines continue to dry up. These people require urgent humanitarian assistance and are exposed to safety and security risks. Therefore, we call for immediate ceasefire and humanitarian access to most affected areas. Thirdly, the humanitarian consequences of the ongoing war are not limited to Ukrainians in their own home territory. Those who had fled remain affected too. Already more than 3 million were forced to leave Ukraine as a result of Russia's military aggression. We have already reached the number of over 1.9 million people who crossed our border since February 24th. Most of them found a shelter in Poland. We have registered already 170 nationalities on our border. That means it considers us all, and we are all the victims of this aggression. Excellencies, as a neighbor and close friend of Ukraine, we see firsthand the dramatic humanitarian consequences of this war. Every day on the Polish-Ukrainian border, we are witnessing a growing number of people who cross the border severely traumatized. We believe that the involvement of UN bodies and agencies experienced in dealing with this kind of needs, together with the continued efforts of the Polish authorities, will bring rapid and appropriate solution. In the spirit of solidarity, Poland will continue to admit and provide shelter, food, healthcare, and safety to every person in need, regardless of their nationality, race, or religion's creed. Aside from the institutional care, thousands of Polish people are organizing in a bottom-up way, showing the solidarity with Ukraine, opening their homes to refugees, and volunteering at reception centers. Excellencies, as I'm delivering this speech, Poland's president's spouse, Agata Kornhauser-Duda, is building up an international coalition of first ladies and highnesses and all the peoples of goodwill to effectively protect those in vulnerable situations, namely women, children, elderly persons, and persons with disabilities, many of them with post-traumatic disorder. The Polish government has urgently implemented new immigration measures for Ukrainian citizens fleeing their country. The new law that took effect on Monday legalizes the stay of citizens of Ukraine in order to enable them to take up employment and provide them with healthcare, education, and accommodation in Poland. It also offers temporary financial help to Polish citizens who welcomed refugees in their homes. Ukrainian citizens may apply for one-time subsidy to answer their basic needs. The government will allocate funds for schooling of Ukrainian students. Every Ukrainian citizen fleeing the war has been guaranteed the access to the public healthcare system in the same way as Polish citizens have. We will continue to provide assistance to Ukrainian citizens fleeing the horrors of war brought on them by Russia. And I can tell you already we got 45,000 of pupils subscribed to Polish schools from Ukraine. But we and the other countries of the region, which I see the ambassadors here in the room, we all need urgently an assistance of international assistance in these good deeds. Excellencies, today Ukraine pays a high price for defending its independence, territorial integrity, and democracy and UN Charter. The determination and courage of Ukrainian people inspires the world. We cannot fail them. It is crucial to show our solidarity with Ukraine and its people by acting now, and I thank you.
أشكر ممثل بولندا على بيانه. لم يعد هناك أسماء مدرجة على قائمة المتحدثين. رفعت الجلسة.
While the fighting continues, yeah. Why not stop the fighting? Because we came there with goals announced. We want to demilitarize Ukraine, to denazify it, and to make Ukraine a neutral state which is not threatening Russia.
But why stop the fighting until that's achieved?
Negotiating are going on.
What evidence are you going to bring tomorrow on chemical and biological weapons?
We have additional information on that, and I think it deserves new information, that it deserves being discussed in the Security Council. And that's not a joke, that's not a Russian propaganda, because more and more people in the West, including US and UK, are asking questions on that military bio programs that US was conducting in Ukraine, and not just in Ukraine. That applies to many US-sponsored laboratories around the world.
Mr. Ambassador, the Secretary General said that no
Are you planning to use biological weapons? No, same to you. You can't use them.
fuel on fire.
Yeah, nobody should, but who is putting fuel on fire except the Russian army?
But so you think what? Any improvement on the end of this horrible war?
Professor, could you stand behind that tape so that all the cameras can...
Hi, all right. Are you still paranoid with COVID? No. Anyway, tell me. Any improvement? No, there is no improvement. The actions of the Russian Federation continue to be very brazen, and the atrocities are taking place every day, unfortunately.
Tomorrow, the President of the United States is going to speak with the leader of China, because he's going to ask that China is not going to help. No. The question is, from what the Chinese ambassador said today, what is
Do
your
I
sense?
look like a Chinese spokesperson? I don't, thank you.
Is your president going to speak to the General Assembly?
Can I ask you, after many weeks of putting questions to me, can you identify yourself, please?
Dulcie Leinbach from Pass Blue.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yes, is your president going to speak to the General Assembly?
When the time comes, he may. All right? Have a good day. Goodbye.